Okay, can you see my slides now?
Yeah, that's all good.
All right. All right, thank you, Ruth. As she said, my name is Michael Hall. I am a community manager currently at InfluxData. And today I'm going to talk about something that I've been paying attention to and working on for my entire career as a community manager, which is almost 10 years now. Two questions that I keep coming across, that I keep asking myself are, is my community healthy, and how can I make it better? If you're a community manager or a community leader, you've probably asked yourself the same questions. You very likely have been asked these questions either by your manager or by an interviewer when you're applying for a community job. These are questions that I think every community manager or lead wants to answer, but struggles to. So what do? When we want to go and we want to answer these questions, the first thing we do is we say, okay, let's gather metrics. So we go out and we find all of the different things about our community that we can measure. We pull it all in, we aggregate it all, and we start looking at the numbers. So we get numbers on how many people we have, how many projects we have, what kind of activity there is. And we start to graph them, and we start to break them out into multiple segments. We'll plot the changes of them. We'll build up dashboards. We'll get multiple charts and multiple shapes and multiple colors until we're basically just drowning in metrics. We've got a number for everything. We've got numbers all over the place. So with all that data, can we answer our questions? Can we look at these numbers and give a definitive answer to these two questions that we're all facing? So I'm going to start out with the first one. Is my community healthy? It's a pretty simple question. You'd think it's got a pretty simple answer. So we take that question and we look at our numbers. First, let's look at our member metrics. Let's say we look at those and we find out that we've got 100 members in our community. Well, does that mean that our community is healthy? What if that number was 1,000 members? Is it healthy then? Maybe we've got a really big community. We've got 10,000 members in it. Is that a healthy community? Well, it really kind of depends. Maybe you have a lot of people, but they're not very active. Or maybe you've got a small number of people, but they're really, really engaged in doing a lot of work. Maybe you're a new community. You're small, but you're growing pretty quickly. Or you're a big community and you're growing at a steady rate, but not a real huge rate. Are those people there because your product's hard to use? Are you not getting as many people because your product's easy to use? There's so many different things that could be in play here that we really can't say for any of these scenarios whether that community is healthy looking at just the membership numbers that we have. The size of the community just doesn't tell us enough for us to answer if that community is healthy or not. All right, so let's forget about member size then. Let's look at the activity in our community. An active community is a healthy community, right? So we'll look at those metrics and we'll see that we've got 1,000 contributions. Is that healthy? What if that number was 10,000? We have 10,000 contributions coming in. It's more, but is it healthy? What if we've got 100,000 contributions? That's a whole lot of contributions. Not many projects have that many. But does that mean that our community is healthy? Well, once again, it depends. Sometimes the contribution is a lot of work. Sometimes it isn't. If you think about Wikipedia, all you really need to contribute to Wikipedia is a web browser and knowledge on some topic. You can go and you can make hundreds of contributions to Wikipedia in not a whole lot of time. On the other hand, if you look at, say, the Linux kernel or Kubernetes, these big complex software projects, you really need a lot of skill, knowledge, and experience before you can start making significant contributions to those. And those contributions tend to be fewer but larger, both in size and in impact. So sometimes you'll get contributions that are broken into small pieces. You can get a lot of them. Sometimes you're going to get some really big contributions, but all in one lump chunk. So if you look just at the number of contributions that you're getting, that really can't tell you if that community is healthy or not. Again, all of these three scenarios could be healthy or could be unhealthy. There's really no way to tell looking at our contribution numbers either. All right, so we'll stop looking at total numbers altogether and we'll look at growth. The truth is in the trend is a very common saying, and generally it's a correct saying too. So let's look at our growth either in members or in contributions and say, okay, we're seeing 10% growth. Is that healthy? Growth is good. Is 10% healthy good or not healthy good? What if it's 100% growth? Now you're doubling your number of members or your number of contributions. Sounds pretty good, right? Or maybe you're seeing absolutely explosive growth. You're seeing 1,000% growth. That's huge. It has to be a sign that your community is healthy, right? Well, once again, there are too many different things here to really say. It really depends on a lot of other factors. If you're going from 2 people in your community to 4 people in your community, well, that's 100% growth right there. On the other hand, if you're going from 100,000 contributions to 110,000 contributions, that's only 10% growth. Which one of those is healthy? Are either of them healthy? So really, the vast majority of people are going to see growth somewhere between 1% and 1,000%. And healthy could be anywhere along that range. And also unhealthy is all across that range also. So really, growth isn't going to tell us either if our community is healthy or not. So what about our second question? How can I make it better? Well, let's look at these metrics again and see if any of those could answer this question for us. Going back to our membership numbers. If you've got a small community with 100 members, how can you make that one better? Or if you've got 1,000 members, how do you make that better? Or if you've got your fairly large community of 10,000 members, and you ask, well, how can I make this better? Well, yep, we're back here again. It depends. A lot of people will give you advice on what you should do in your community, but most of the time that advice is going to be really generic and will work for communities of any size. It's going to be based on things that they've done in the past, things that they know have worked for them, but not necessarily things that they know are what you need in your specific circumstances. Maybe your community is small because it fills a niche, so trying to grow the membership numbers might not be the right approach for you, even though it is for somebody else. Or maybe it's big because your users need a lot of help, and trying to break down that group of people into teams to make them more efficient isn't what they need. But measuring the size of your community isn't going to tell you which of those things you should be doing. So there's two possible answers there's a lot of possible answers for how do we make our community better. The answers may or may not be the right thing for any of these 3 different sizes of community. So whether something's the right thing for you to do or not is really going to depend on the size of your community. All right, so let's go back to our contribution metrics, see if that does any better. Say you've got that 1,000 contributions coming in. How can you make that community better? What if it's 10,000 contributions? Does that tell you what you should be doing? Or maybe you've already got, that 100,000 contributions coming in. Your community's doing a lot of stuff already. But what can you do to make that better? Yeah, we're back here. It depends. Just like how the number of contributions didn't tell us if the community was healthy or not, it's also not going to tell us what we should be doing next to make it better. There are different things that you can think of that you can try that may or may not apply. But what insights are these numbers actually giving you at the end of the day? If they can't tell you what your next step is, then what good are they doing you? All right, last one of these, I promise. We're going to go back and we're going to look at the growth rate. If you've got that 10% growth rate, small but steady, what should you be doing now to improve that, to make that better? If you get up to that 100% growth rate, what should you be doing then? If you're seeing 1,000% growth rate, that might mean that you don't have to do much to make it better, but it's still not telling you, where you may be falling short or what you should be doing. See, we keep coming back to this. It always ends up with "it depends." And frankly, it's frustrating. It was frustrating to me whenever I asked these questions or whenever somebody asked me these questions. Every time I had to start my answer with, well, it depends. And the reality is that for community managers and community leaders, the metrics just can't answer these questions for us. I know that's not an answer we want to hear. It's really nice when we can, boil everything down into a set of numbers. Because with numbers, it's real easy to say, okay, this number is more than that number, and more real easy to say for sure whether or not we're doing a good job. But knowing that your numbers are more or less than somebody else's numbers isn't really going to tell you if you're doing a better job or not. Looking even at your own numbers in the past, if the number goes up year over year, that tells you something, but it doesn't necessarily tell you if your community is healthy, and it certainly isn't going to tell you what you should be doing to make your community better. So then what can we do? Are we just out of luck trying to answer these questions? Are we forever stuck having to go by gut feelings and instincts and looking back at what's worked for us in the past or what's worked for other people in the past and throwing things at the wall and trying to see what sticks in our particular case that we're involved in right now? Or is there some way that we can get actual answers to these questions, some concrete, definitive answers, regardless of how big your community is or how active your community is or how mature your community is? Well, it turns out that, yes, there is something that can, and that's data. Now, we just went through a lot of metrics data, didn't we? And none of those things was able to answer the questions that we were asking. So we even said, metrics can't answer them. So what do I mean by data can give us those answers? Well, everything we looked at previously was metrics. And metrics are only a subset of the data that you have about your community. There's all kinds of other things like notes that you have on individuals, the context of when and why they joined or what they're doing, what they're contributing to and when they're contributing to it, the stage of their involvement in your community. Are they a newcomer who's just getting started? Have they been there for a while and are now stepping up their contributions or into a leadership role? And a whole lot more that can't be boiled down into numbers, but is still really, really useful data to have. Today, I'm going to focus in on one specific form of this to see if we can use it to answer these two questions that we started out with. So I'm going to look specifically at relationships, because I think that relationships are the foundation of every community, anywhere, any size. It's about their relationships with you. It's about their relationships with each other. And it's these relationships between people that keep them coming back day after day and year after year. It's the relationships that make them want to get more involved, want to step up and do more, want to help others coming into the community after them. These relationships are going to outlast us as community managers. As we come and go from a company or a project, those relationships are going to still be there even after we're gone. In many cases, these relationships will even outlast the projects that they formed around. I know I have several really good close friends now that started off as community relationships around the Ubuntu community years and years ago. And even though neither of us are really involved in that community anymore, we've still maintained those relationships and those friendships over the years. So I'm going to look specifically at my current community, the InfluxData community. What I did is I started looking at the relationships that were going on there, who was talking to who. And even though that's not data that you could put into numbers, it turns out that it is data you can put into a graph. And this is what that graph looks like. This is a snapshot of my community at a given point in time. Each of the little circles on this graph represents a specific person in the community, and all of those lines represent a connection between that person and another person. And the more connections that somebody has, the bigger their circle is. And by graphing this data this way, you start to see a shape and a structure to your community that the numbers alone can't really tell you. If I were to give a number for each of these connections and rank people by how many of them they had, I would get the same people at the top of the list as I have, these large circles there. But it doesn't tell the whole story about how they relate in the community as a whole. And it's this shape and this structure, this non-metric data that we can look at and visualize. That's what I think we need in order to be able to answer these questions. So taking this data, this non-metric data, and the form and the structure that it's showing us, let's go back and see if we can answer these questions that we had from the start. Our first one was, is our community healthy? Can we finally say whether or not it's healthy? Almost, but there's one thing we need to do first. We need to take a step back and ask what we mean by healthy now. Since we're not looking at numbers, we need to know what it is we're actually going to be looking for in order to say whether something is healthy or not. Instead of asking what the number should be, we have to ask, what's the shape of a healthy community? What does a healthy community look like? And I've identified 4 different stages that the community has to go through in order to reach a level that I would consider healthy. The first one is that people need to be making connections. That's the bare minimum before anybody's actually in your community. If they're not making a connection with anyone else in your community, then they're not themselves in your community. They're just observers. They're passing by on the outside. So somebody reading documentation on your website or looking at an answer on Stack Overflow, if they don't connect with anyone, then even though they've had some value out of your community, they haven't become a part of it themselves. Second thing is you want those connections to start to form a network. You don't want people in these separate groups that are completely disconnected. If you have that, then you don't have one community. In reality, you've got all of these different fragments of community floating out there, but not a single cohesive whole, which is what you really want in a healthy community. The third thing is you want that network to start to form a mesh. And by that, I mean that you want people to be able to directly connect to each other across all different parts of the community. You don't want someone to have to go through levels of middle management or community leaders before they can connect to somebody else. You want those connections to spread out all across your network and form this intertwined mesh of everybody. And the last thing you're going to want is you're going to want your community to have guides and not gatekeepers. And if you don't know what I mean by this, don't worry. I'm going to get more into that later with some examples to really highlight what I mean. So let's go look at some examples. All of these graphs I'm going to show you represent a segment of my actual community. So the real data that I took earlier in this year. And we're going to look at them and we're going to see if they're healthy or not, and then what we can do to make them better. So in this case, there's some connections being made between people, but it's not forming a network. People come in Usually they'll just come in and ask a question, they'll get an answer, and that's it. They're not connecting with anybody other than that one person that they got an answer from. It's really not feeling like a community. It feels almost like, going to a party where you only know one other person. You don't feel like you're really a part of that party until you know more than that. In this other example, this part of my community had started to form a network. They were all linked together, but we're not seeing that mesh structure that I mentioned earlier. There's kind of this backbone of connections that connect all these different groups together, but not a whole lot of connections directly between individuals. It's technically one community, but people don't really feel like they're connecting with each other. It's still very much a one-on-one thing. And in order to connect with somebody else in this network, it's really like playing that 6 degrees of separation with Kevin Bacon game, where you see, okay, this person knows this person who knows this person, and see how many hops it takes to get a connection between one person or another. Or like in LinkedIn, where you're the 4th or 5th level connection to somebody, and you need to trace that path in order to figure out how to get that personal introduction to them. It's a network, but it really still doesn't feel very much like a community. And the last segment I looked at, it shows a lot of connections. We're starting to see that mesh effect where people are connecting to a lot of other people. But we still have far too many people who have just one connection. And worst of all, in this case, all of those connections, or nearly all of those connections, are going to just one person. This one person is like the core of this segment of my community. And what happens if that person goes away? If I lose just one person, now all of those connections are, lost from my community. So looking at these graphs and, keeping in mind that this is real data from my real community, I asked the question, is my community healthy? And the answer was no. Obviously this is not the answer that I wanted to hear. It's not the answer that any of us really wants to hear from this question. But we have an answer now. It's not, it depends anymore. It's not a great answer, but we finally got to the point where we have a yes or no answer to this question that we've been struggling with for so long now. Even if it's not the answer we wanted, that's still better than what we had before. Okay, so now that I know my community is not healthy, how can I make it better? After all, we don't want to just stop with, okay, my community is not healthy, right? We want to take that knowledge and that data that we have, and we want to turn that into some actions. What's the point of knowing that your community is healthy or not if you don't know what to do about it? So now that we've got that data, we need to find out what that data is telling us. So when we see in that first example where connections weren't being formed, that really means that those conversations are transactional. Like I said, somebody comes in with a question, somebody else gives them an answer, and that's it. They're gone. That's the only interactions that they have in the community. It was technically an interaction in the community, but it's not a lasting connection. In those cases, you really want to encourage people to go beyond that transaction, to strike up conversations, to get more information about what people are working on, what they're excited about, what brought them to this point that they're at, where they hope to go from there. You want to encourage that kind of friendly conversation, get them to make friends, just something to get beyond that simple, transactional state. In the second one, where we're not forming a mesh, that usually means that nobody's really stepping up to be a guide. You want people who will, help introduce somebody to somebody else, point them in the right direction where they need to go. A lot of times, especially when people are volunteering to help in your community, they don't jump into a conversation unless they already know that they can provide an answer or a solution to that conversation. So you really want to encourage people to start talking, even if they don't know the answer, even if they're sure they're not going to know the answer, to start talking to those people, get more information out of them, help them find where they need to go and who they need to talk to. And lastly, when we see that that kind of connection halo, where you've got all of these people connected to just one person in your community, and that's the only connection that they have, that almost always means that this person is trying to do way too much by themselves. And it's not usually because they're, trying to do anything wrong, or they don't, want your community to be healthy. More often than not, they think that they have to do this because nobody else is going to. And when you see that, you really need to help them, kind of step back a little bit and spread that work around. Help them find people who can take on some of this responsibility for them in a way that makes them feel like this community is still going to be taken care of. All right, so that's what our data is telling us is wrong with our community. So now that we know that, how can we make it better? What can we do with this information in order to improve our community? Again, I'm going to look at my specific examples and what I did. So going back to this first example where I had some interactions going on, but it was all transactional and we weren't forming a cohesive community. In this case, I went to the people who were answering these questions, and I just started encouraging them to, have more context, more exchange in these conversations instead of them being just providing the answer. Find out, like I said, what they were doing that brought them here, what they're trying to accomplish. People like to talk about the things that they're interested in and the things that they're building, and this is a great opportunity to build those kind of relationships up. Sorry. So I encourage people to just kind of be more casual in their conversations. Bring up the kind of water cooler talk that you get in an office where you just kind of shoot the breeze, or as my manager likes to say, he says, just hang out in the community. You don't have to have a goal of accomplishing anything, closing PRs, answering questions. Just kind of hang out and let those conversations happen. Get to know the people in your community, the new people who are coming in, and try and build those relationships up beyond that simple, almost like a fast food restaurant where you're trying to get them out the door as soon as possible, get them what they came for and get them out. That's not what we want for a community. We want something that's going to last a little bit longer than that. And so when they started doing this, we started building up these larger connections between groups. They were able to introduce people to other groups that had similar interests or similar problems. And the best thing is when just a handful of people started doing this, more people started joining in and doing the same thing, following their example. So connections started being made between these disparate groups, bringing them together into a single community. In the next case, everybody was technically in the same network, but they were separated by so many steps that it really wasn't working out as a cohesive whole. Even though somebody might know how to make a good connection, they weren't necessarily doing that. Usually because people wouldn't join into a conversation until they already were sure that they could provide an answer or a solution to that. So in that case, what I did is I looked at the people who already had multiple connections. They already knew multiple other people in the community and were more likely to be able to help somebody find the right person that they needed to talk to, even if it wasn't that person themselves. So I got a handful of people to start acting as greeters in the community, helping new people as they came in with questions, regardless of what the question was or whether they could help that person directly. And the goal was just to get information, to build up those conversations, and then to tag in other people once they found out who the right people were for that. And again, people saw them doing this, and they started to learn who those other people were. So even beyond that select group of greeters that I had, people, once they knew who an expert was in a specific topic, could jump in and help make those connections to other people in the community. And again, it just kind of expanded beyond that initial group of people that we had. And then people started forming these connections all across the network now. And finally, we have the case where we have what I call a community hero. And this one was particularly challenging because the problem was that somebody was being too helpful. And that's not something you typically think of as a problem. And I didn't want to discourage the activity that this person had. You know, they were doing a whole lot of work for the community. They were doing a whole lot of good. But unfortunately, they had really hit the limit of what they could do. You know, they had maxed out their time and energy trying to answer every question and help every person that came in. And when they couldn't do more, it meant that nothing more was getting done. They were simultaneously stopping the community from growing like it should, and they were getting burnt out as a result of that. But the reality was they really didn't need to be doing it all by themselves. And this is usually going to be the case when you have somebody who's taken on too much of a workload on their own. What tends to happen is that one person thinks that they have to do everything because they don't see anyone else stepping up to help. And everybody else sees this person doing everything, and so they feel like they aren't needed to step up and help them. And it becomes kind of this vicious circle where, you know, the more they take on, the more they have to take on because they're sending a message to everybody else that nobody else needs to do it. So in that case, I had to help them identify some people that they already trusted, people that they already worked with, that they knew the topic as well as them, and could answer these questions and take over these different responsibilities that they had brought upon themselves. So we went out and we asked these people to start taking over these different roles and giving them the responsibility and the authority that they needed. And we set some clear documentation on what we expected them to do, what the processes were, the scope of the work that we were asking them to do, so that everybody felt comfortable. And we can take a lot of this burden off of this one person, spread it around to multiple people, and let them grow a community around this group instead of around this individual. So after doing all that and looking back at these before and after graphs of my community, having identified what the problems were, what steps could be done to correct them, and taking those steps. Now, if I go and I compare these before and after graphs, and I ask myself, is my community healthy? Well, finally, I can say yes. It's never a done process. This is a cycle of things that you're going to iterate over and over and over on. But we can definitively say yes, based on the data, my community is healthier now than it was before I did this. We're not saying it depends anymore. We're not, going by gut feeling or anything. We have an actual answer. It's an answer that's backed by data, and it's data that helped guided my actions to get us from unhealthy to healthy. But we're not quite done yet. Sooner or later, you're going to have to report on your success. You're going to have an annual review. Your manager's going to ask you if you've met your goals for this quarter, this year, whatever. And you're going to be able to want to provide a definitive answer to that. So how do we turn this non-metric data into something that we can give them to show our success? For that, I have a couple of suggestions. The first one is to track these visual changes like I did. Take a before and after screenshots of what your community looked like. so that you can point to things like there being fewer disconnected parts of your community, that you formed them more into, a cohesive whole. You can show that you've got more of these central hubs, these guides, who are making connections between people instead of acting as a bottleneck between them. And you can show that you've taken a lot of the load off of individuals who are trying to do everything, and you've spread that around to a supportive group of people who can, collectively take that on. It's not as simple as a metric number that you can point to, but it is, concrete data that you can use to show improvement over time. Another thing you can do when you're setting up future goals is to be very, very specific about those actions. So instead of saying, you want to grow your membership or you want to increase contributions, do things like, I've noticed these two important groups in my community don't have anybody connecting them together. So one of my goals is to make sure that, in 6 months' time, these two groups are now connected, that we've got one or more people acting as a bridge, and we're bringing them together instead of them being isolated from each other. Say you want to recruit 5 people in your community to start acting as guides. Again, that's something that you can show the effectiveness of using those graphs, those before and after graphs. And also when you see these heroes with that connection halo around them, say, okay, I want this hero to delegate that work to at least 3 others, and we'll form a team around that, and we will get that halo broken up and spread around. And all of these things are things that you can point to and say for sure whether you accomplished them or not. Even though they're not numbers, even though it's not this is more than that, you can still point to these and say, okay, that is success. That is me having reached my goals. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope everybody's found this thought-provoking. I hope you found the suggestions that I have here useful. I want to thank Ruth and CMX Ipswich for inviting me to come and give this presentation to you all. Again, my name is Michael Hall. My Twitter is mhall119. You can email me anytime at michael@savannahhq.com. And if you like these graphs, and you're wondering how you can make those graphs yourself, I built a tool specifically for this kind of data gathering and presentation and to answer these kinds of questions. It's a hosted service. You can find out more about it on savannahhq.com. And if you're interested in giving it a try for your own community, we support multiple data sources: Slack, GitHub, Discord, Discourse, Reddit, Stack Overflow. So you can connect your communities to it, and you can start building up this type of graph that I've shown you, and a whole bunch of other things. And if you use this promo code CMX Ipswich, you'll get 3 months free on that service as a thank you for attending my talk. All right, so let's see. Let me find the tab with the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Michael.
And see if we've got any questions.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a few questions that are on there. One was about, could you verbally describe the network mesh that you were talking about? Like, could you explain it in words, what that means and what it looks like?
Yeah, so if I'm going to use a networking analogy, so if you're familiar with the network topologies where everything comes down to a central point and then it spreads out from there, and one of those might be a central point for its own network of nodes, but you never have a node from one end of a branch and another end of a branch coming together. Maybe a tree analogy is better. You don't have leaves connected to leaves. Leaves connect to branches, branches connect to the trunk, but you don't have leaves connected directly to each other. In a mesh, all of those different things can connect to all of those different things. And you never have a single point of failure or a single path that everything has to go through to reach any other part of the network. So you want it to look maybe a little bit more like a spider web, where there's a lot more connections and a lot less hierarchy and like org chart kind of structure to it.
Great, cool.
And I hope, I don't know if that came in before I was presenting the examples, but I hope maybe some of the visual examples explain that a little bit better.
Yeah.
All right. So Ruth, you asked, is there any merit in reporting the big numbers if they are not so relevant? Yes. I mean, there's still data. It's still useful data, even if it couldn't answer those two questions we specifically had. It's still useful to track growth over time because, as I said, the truth is in the trend. And if you see that you're growing, steadily up and to the right, and then things just kind of plateau, that usually means that there's a reason for that you need to look into. So all of that data is still useful, and it's still worth tracking and reporting on.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to suggest that you shouldn't track metrics, just that metrics should only be one part of a larger whole of what you're tracking.
I've also found, like, as the community evolved and as I got to have more of a sense of what was important, that what I reported on changed as well. So like initially it was just the numbers, but then as I got more of a sense of what actually mattered in the community, I started to look at, well, how can I report on those numbers? So I think it also will change over your maturity as a community manager, over the community growing. Things will be different that you report over time. That's been my experience anyway.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm trying to accomplish with Savannah is to boil that experience that a lot of people have into something reusable that everybody can get.
I've found it really helpful using those network graphs in our open source community to like pick up on people who might be good to sort of promote into leadership roles, or to ask if they would like to take up becoming a forum moderator, for example, or joining the triage team. If I see that they're super active and super connected in those particular areas. And then the people who are all over the place tend to be people who are good in leadership roles because they're connecting the dots across different tools or platforms.
Right. So much of leadership is person-to-person interactions, not code contributions. So yeah, having that information and being able to pick out who the key people are based on that connection graph is useful, and it's something that I use several times while improving my own community. You asked, how can you look at people coming into, oops, just scrolled out of view, hang on. How can you look at people coming into being an active community member from just an observer? That's tricky. A lot of people never are going to be part of your community. All they need is to be an observer. All they need are those docs that you have or a question that's already been answered. And I think that's okay. Not everybody has to be a part of your community. I think the harder part is taking them from that first interaction that they have and holding on to them after that. That's a big thing that I know my community struggles with sometimes, and a lot of other communities do. People will come in, they'll have that first interaction, but getting them to a second interaction is the hard step. And a lot of people get lost at that one. Kelsey has asked, how do we go from starting to creating these network maps? If you mean the visuals themselves, you can use Savannah for that. I used a JavaScript library called D3 that does a whole bunch of different graph types, and made it real easy once I had the data collected to build that visualization. In terms of actually building your community so that it looks like that, the things I said, have casual conversations, get people to talk person to person and not just solutions and Q&A based. Like I said, people love to talk about things they're interested in. Once you get them going, you can really keep that going and bring more people in and introduce them to other people in your community and let them build up connections and relationships to them. And it just kind of scales or builds up over time the more you do it. And it's that just being casual and friendly, that's the key to that step. All right, Teresa says, I know we focus a lot on these graph and relationships, but is there any other important data you'd recommend to share and show the health of a community? Yeah, so one of the other things that I look at in Savannah is we've got a chart that shows how many people you have at different stages of involvement in your community. And I talked about how you get a lot of visitors that tend to drop off. You have a lot of people who will make one contribution but don't keep coming back and making more contributions. So I've got a graph that will show kind of the relative size of how many people have gone through each of those stages. And again, when you look at the shape of it, the shape kind of tells you where you're struggling, where you're not doing as well as you should. And then once you know where and why that's going on, then you know what steps you need to do to start to improve that. So that I didn't cover that in this topic. I was just focusing on the one, but there's more than this in Savannah also. Kelsey asks, when forum comes up, will this program be able to monitor there? Anything with an API that I can pull data out of, we can pull that data in. And it'll combine it with all your existing other sources too. So if you've got forum and Slack and GitHub, we can combine all that information. You can merge members from all three of those different sources so that you can see what they're doing across those. And also there's a different network graph that I have that will show you who's involved in which of these platforms. So you can see, which ones have a lot of overlap and which ones don't, and who you have in multiple of those at a time. Again, all stuff that I couldn't fit into this presentation, but if you go to savannahhq.com, you can get more of that information. And again, give it a try and see if it works for you.
Great. I think that's all the questions we
have. All right. That is the last. Yep. So I know this today's event is going to go on, but unfortunately I do have a meeting with my manager in 5 minutes, so I'm going to have to drop off. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Thank you for those great questions. And thank you again, Ruth,
thank you so much for giving us
here.
your time and your expertise as well, Michael. It's been really great hearing about Savannah and hearing about.
And if you want to know more, feel free to email me. We can set up a time to go through it if you'd like.
Awesome. Great. So what we're going to do now, folks, is going to hop into breakout rooms where we can chat a bit about what we've heard today and also get to know each other a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just create a couple of breakout rooms, and you'll get a message to say you're invited to join. And usually what I suggest is just a quick round of like who you are, where you work, or what your community is that you're interested in or thinking about working or creating. And today, our top tip for maintaining health and well-being during lockdown, because I think a lot of us are still in lockdown at the moment, and then just see where the conversation takes you. So we'll have 10 minutes, then we'll come back into here for a quick wrap up and what's coming next month, and then we'll end the session. So bear with me a second, you'll get an invitation to join your breakout rooms